The Horse Race is brought to you by Benchmark Strategies, Boston's leading public affairs and public relations consulting firm. To learn more, connect with Benchmark on LinkedIn at Benchmark Strategies or visit benchmark-strategies.com.
Welcome back to The Horse Race, your weekly look at politics, policy, and elections in Massachusetts. I'm Jennifer Smith, reporter for Commonwealth Beacon.
And I'm Steve Gazella, president of the Massing Polling Group, and it is Thursday, April 2nd. Today, we're starting with the Supreme Court and the big hearing on the question of birthright citizenship. Then, we're talking about a hearing that Jen went to on the racial wealth gap and looking forward to new data we'll have later this year.
Hey, Steve, how are you?
Jen, it's April. It's April Fool's Day, actually, when we're recording this, so I'm assuming you've written some good pranks that you're about to hit me with.
What I have noticed is as we become more irony poisoned, as, you know, all the vibes just start cratering, people just start saying mean things and saying April Fools. That's what we're doing now.
Yeah, that's dark.
Not even a prank.
That's dark. Yeah, I mean, maybe it sort of tracks the death of Twitter, like back when you could be fun and ironic and interesting on Twitter, and then it just became like, nope, you just have to yell, you just have to be mean, you just have to like act in bad faith and assume everybody else is too.
I mean, look, the greatest April Fool's trick of the day is Donald Trump being the first president to sit in on a Supreme Court oral argument. Was that a joke, or does it just hurt my head?
Yeah, I don't know the history there. I trusted the people that I read online that said this had never happened before, and it certainly doesn't seem like it's something that, you know, fits with the general vibe of what is supposed to be, as I gather, the independence of the three branches, but here we are. So that was interesting. Also interesting was, I don't know if it was the argument or the fact that this case exists. I have my own view on this, Jen, but what's yours?
I think whenever we're heading into these kind of arguments before the current Supreme Court, basically. So that's a court where the majority of it is conservative. The majority of it has been appointed by either Donald Trump or his Republican predecessors, is kind of this odd question in the back of my mind all the time, which is, you know, well, how much of this is sort of an overt political exercise and how much of this is still sort of going through the motions of constitutional analysis here. And so that was, I think, for a lot of people, why it was so striking that President Trump showed up for those arguments. Because if you recall, after the most recent ruling on tariffs from the Supreme Court, the president basically spent the weeks afterward kind of spiraling out on Twitter or, X or Truth Social or whatever he's on, but then also kind of in large public statements at the State of the Union, at kind of events since then. So he really has, I think, made it very clear that he expects a certain amount of fidelity to his policy areas from the folks he appointed. And so for him to show up to basically look at them as they consider what is arguably his most controversial case before them, you know, trying to overturn centuries of presumption here, it does leave the question in my mind, you know, will the justices kind of feel one way or the other about that, and doesn't matter?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it will matter to the ruling. I don't, pretend to be inside the minds of the Supreme Court justices. Fortunately for all of us, particularly me. I don't know. The whole thing kind of rubbed me the wrong way, like a lot of these cases have, where you take something which has always been the way that it has been. It is plain to anybody that this is the way that it should be, whether it's, the ruling on, whether Donald Trump could be criminally liable for something he did while president, that whole thing, or now birthright citizenship, which by any plain reading, by any good faith reading, is very clearly spelled out. And pretend that there's some sort of debate about it and have some sort of debate about it and drive some sort of wedge into what used to be kind of a pretty core element of, our national identity, and there's more minor ones too, or more kind of obscure ones. Like there was always this assumption that the civil service was more or less out of reach. Like you couldn't just dissolve agencies and fire tens of thousands of people because you felt like it as the executive. And that now here we are. And lest we question how Donald Trump felt about it, we have his Truth Social posts to refer to here, where he said, no, I'm not going to read it. You know what? I'm not going to read it. That's going to be my rebellion. You can guess what he said.
That's your version of self-care.
That is my version of care for our listeners. If you really want to know, if you can't figure out whether or not he responded in a calm, measured, and legalistic fashion, you can go to Truth Social or any social media site and see what he said.
I too will not read it, mostly because I, would not hurt your attempt at self-care, Steve Koczela. But I would note here the responsible thing to do is perhaps to explain very briefly what the issue is, and then I'll let you tell me about what the polling is on it. So basically, this is an attempt through an executive order by the president that is being challenged to narrow birthright citizenship to you are a U.S. citizen if you're born here, to you are a U.S. citizen if you are born here to U.S. citizen parents or to parents who have permanent immigration status. So that is what they are considering. It would be a massive, massive change. It would leave open a lot of questions about what does this mean for people who were not born here under those circumstances if the court went in one direction or another. But fundamentally, based on oral arguments so far, the justices are at least skeptical, or the majority of them at least seem skeptical to the underpinnings of the president's argument here, pointing not only to the text of the Constitution itself, but also noting that Congress has acted since then to kind of entrench and codify this understanding. So basically, the premise that we've seen so far in oral arguments, and we don't know the way that this is all going to shake out, but the logic that was expressed through some of the skeptical justices was, Congress and everyone else has planned as though this is the understanding for all of this time. So why would we interpret it differently?
Yeah, that is certainly the way that it sounded. And, you probably know the breakdown better than I, but it seems like justices often give at least some indication of how they're feeling about the case through oral arguments. There's some where it's perhaps a bit harder to tell, but this one, there was, almost contempt in some ways, but from the justices toward, the position being argued by the Trump administration. So it feels like we know which way this is going to go, but, I'm a pollster. I don't make predictions. I just describe snapshots in time. Speaking of which, Jen, should we talk about the polling on this issue?
Oh my gosh, I would love to, because I am looking at our little document in front of us and I see a line going up over time, actually.
Yes, it is actually super interesting. So this is a chart that was put together by the good folks over at the New York Times using a variety of different polls. So they kind of found things that were basically, are you favorable to or against the idea of birthright citizenship, and then charted them going all the way back to the mid-90s. And basically what they found was, stretching all the way back there, it actually started, support for birthright citizenship started in the low 40s. And then from about 1995 or so to the mid-2000s, it was around half, and about 45% or so against. And since then, it's actually gone up to where today, it's actually, the latest poll that they showed in here was 62% in favor, 32% opposed. So that is where public opinion is on that question. Of course, there's a party breakdown. There's always a party breakdown. Democrats, 92% say that they support the idea, and even 41% of Republicans. So definitely a growing favorability to the concept.
Yes, I do think that one of the things that was interesting for me, even among the breakdown there, is that, you do have Republicans kind of predictably having the lowest sorts of approval ratings on birthright citizenship, which again, makes perfect sense. It's become an increasingly polarized issue. But what was curious to me is that Republicans actually saw a bigger jump kind of by metrics over the past few years. If you're looking kind of at the proportion of the chart itself, a really exciting thing to describe on podcasts is what charts look like. But the little spike over the past few years was actually bigger for Republicans, though it remains less than half approval. So just an interesting thing, kind of across parties, wherever your baseline is, approval for birthright citizenship has actually gone up over the past few years.
Yeah, and I mean, to put it in political terms, it's not a wedge issue where you've got all of your party on one side and all the other party on the other side, and you're just like trying to raise the salience of the issue, to win an election. Like, this is one where a good swath of Republicans are against the position that Donald Trump is putting forward. So anyway, that is what the polling numbers on that show. There are so many statistics in this episode, though, Jen, I feel like we have to move on and just like do nothing but describe numbers. Should we do that?
I think that's incredible. I'll work in some good initialisms. I'll work in percent versus percentage points. You can do some margin of
Standard
error versus,
deviations,
oh, it'll be
awesome.
great. N plus whatever. Let's do it.
There's a good chance that if you thought at all about the racial wealth gap in Massachusetts, two numbers come to your mind when you think about it: $8 and $247,500. In 2015, that's what the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston reported as the average wealth of a black household and of a white household in the Boston metro area. Now, more than a decade later, state leaders are still wrestling with the shock of that statistic, and Jen, you're here with an update of sorts. So tell us, I know you're always watching hearings. I know that that's like what you do in your spare time and your work time. So, what was the hearing that brought this topic to the fore this week?
I love that you imply even slightly that this is not what everybody spends their free time and work time doing. I don't know. Just, go out there, freelance a civic meeting, have a great time. It's a wonderful, wonderful exercise.
I once ran for local office, actually a couple times, and spent hundreds of hours watching like sewer meetings and sidewalk paving meetings and school finance override meetings. So I'm right there with you. But now I've moved on to another phase of my life, Jen.
That's incredible. I'm thrilled to report. So instead, the phase of your life is I watch the meetings for you and I tell you about them. So the hearing that I was watching this week was the Joint Committee on Racial Equity, Civil Rights, and Inclusion. And this is the fourth meeting that they've had. And this one is looking specifically at the racial wealth gap during the second Trump term. So kind of looking at changes on the national level and how they've impacted that split that we've heard so much about between white households and black households, though, of course, racial equity also crosses into, Hispanic and Latino households, Asian households, a variety. But the stark example that they kind of had in mind going in is that one that you just mentioned. $8 of average wealth for a black household in Boston versus almost $250,000 for a white household.
Right, and we should say that is just emphasized that that's from 2015, so it's aging quickly, and there certainly were there was a lot of shock about it at the time, of course, as there should be, just given the starkness of it. But there were also some just methodological questions about was this number strong enough that we should treat it with this much weight. So part of the idea behind doing it again now was A, it needs an update, even if it was perfect, it needs an update, and B, like, can we dig in further? Can we expand samples? Can we explore some other groups where we didn't get enough last time to really say anything consistent or strong? So Jen, what was the hearing about, and where are we on this?
So the context here, as you noted, is that we're dealing with a report that's more than a decade old, but we also have changes on the federal level in terms of the Trump administration taking a pretty critical eye at initiatives that have to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So a lot of efforts over the past 10 years or so, especially in states like Massachusetts, have been focused on the idea that if you see a stat like that, if you see a gap like that, you go, well, something's going on here at the very least. You might be content neutral on whether or not it is good, but something is happening. So we should probably take a look at it. And so efforts to kind of address that racial wealth gap have been running into some kind of antagonism at the federal level. We've seen that in terms of the way that the Trump administration has kind of targeted grant funding by threatening to take it away or attempting to take it away from organizations that have so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion principles or initiatives. There are changes to certain social support services through the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act from last year. So there have been a number of things, both philosophically and practically, coming from the second Trump administration that this committee is trying to figure out kind of where we're landing on this.
Right, and of course, college admissions comes to mind as another thing which has changed not because of the Trump administration, but because of the Supreme Court in that case. And of course, there are all kinds of policies, big and small, that are impacting this: policies of the SBA, policies throughout the federal government on a whole range of issues. One of them, of course, too, is impacts coming from the Supreme Court and higher education specifically.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because this was a packed hearing. This hearing lasted for, 3 hours and 20 minutes, if I'm looking at the recording of it correctly. And it basically brought in people from sort of across industries. So we've got lawyers, we've got, the Fed of Boston, we've got urban policy and planning at Tufts, we've got the Boston Women's Workforce Council, and we also had folks who were talking about kind of the specific educational space as well. And one of the reasons that I think that that's a great point to sort of start in on is it illustrates a number of problems in what they were trying to deal with here. One of them is basically saying, well, what is the actual messaging that we're getting when we talk about the federal government? Because, as you note, that's not just coming from the president, it's also coming, for instance, from the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court said that you can't have affirmative action in the way that we've understood it in higher education, one thing that was pointed out during the hearing is, well, states, for instance, have been able to get a little bit creative about that, or municipalities have gotten to get a little bit creative about that, which is maybe, okay, you can't incorporate literal racial characteristics, but perhaps you could have admission standards that take into account certain zip codes. Maybe they could take into account income levels. Maybe they could take into account a certain ratio from different schools to make sure that there's geographic balance there. And so the idea that you might be getting sort of these broad condemnations of the use of race in applications and admissions policy. And, a state can't just say, we're going to ignore the Supreme Court. But what they can do is say, okay, you've handed something down. Let's try and work within the letter of the law that you've given us to try and still advance those initiatives that we, the state of Massachusetts in this case, think are valuable. So that's a really great example of, here's a problem from the federal government. This is what kind of the limitations are of state power, and this is how sort of state authorities have tried to work around it.
Okay, and that brings us to the obvious question, which is, how are they trying to work around it? What is the state legislature actually saying they're going to do, or that they even can do?
So this hearing was kind of interesting because it is sort of an advisory purpose, basically. Like, they have been bringing people in to sort of brief them on what the situation is and make recommendations. So there are a few recommendations that came out of this hearing that I would like to highlight. And the first one, Steve, is a big one for those of us on, old hashtag Mappily verse. Do you remember Seed My Baby, Steve?
Jen, I don't. You should tell me what that is, because that episode has slipped my mind. No, I do remember what that is. It was a program where they were going to
have brain damage.
It was a program where they were going to do basically baby bonds, where the state deposits money into an account when you're born, and then it grows, and then you have an account that you can also put money into. And there's all this research that shows that this increases savings behavior and increases, all kinds of positive outcomes. The hashtag was one that the Treasurer's Office came up with when they came up with this program, and there were all these photos of serious-looking officials standing behind a podium with a sign on it that said hashtag Seed MA Baby.
Oh, it's great.
Apparently, no young people looked at those photos, but looked at that hashtag before they put that out. But it's still funny.
I will say, so the reason that I bring this up is because baby bonds were one of the solutions that a few folks recommended, and it was a good excuse to go back to these 2018 press releases, including one in which the treasurer, Deb Goldberg, and then Mayor Marty Walsh are on opposite sides of this just gigantic check on which is written "Seed My Baby." And, Deb Goldberg is holding a baby. I don't remember whose baby it was. And Marty Walsh has a look on his face that I cannot possibly explain. So that was, just a great throwback to me. But, there are a number of different things that they can do. Some of the suggestions were essentially along the line of kind of try to defend and preserve some of the things that have taken effect over the past few years, namely, for instance, the Fair Share Amendment or the millionaire's tax, whatever you want to call it, kind of pushing back against state tax cuts, and then, maybe making some changes around corporate tax provisions by decoupling state policy from federal policy on those. So that is extremely fun and sexy. And then some of the other ones got a little bit more kind of tethered to existing policies. So things like they're still trying to fix the supplier diversity pipeline. Who is applying to become a state contractor, who's bidding on it, who's winning it, who gets paid on time. A lot of these have been focused in the past kind of just on like who gets certified to be a supplier, but not necessarily looking at how the process actually sort of plays out and if it's playing out as it should.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on that one as somebody who applies regularly for state, local contracts. And I think that, the goal makes perfect sense. You want the money that the state gives out to reflect the population that lives in the state. You would want to support small businesses as they grow. You want to support local businesses, et cetera. But to me, the limitation that we face as a small business is the staggering amount of paperwork that you have to do. It's not that there isn't enough set-asides for small businesses or not enough assistance to, form your business or whatever. It's that RFPs are routinely 150 pages long that we have to read just to know what we're supposed to write, which is often 60 or 70 pages long. Like it's not just do we have the right set-asides and the right policy. It is absolutely the complexity of signing up to be with SDO office. It's absolutely the amount of paperwork that you have to fill out for these RFPs. Okay, that is a soapbox that I've long wanted to stand on. So thank you for the opportunity, Jen. Please, though, I know there are other policies. So what else is the state doing?
I mostly talk about hearings so that you can talk about supplier and contractor rules and policy. I will say, like, you are not off the wall on this one. It did come up, this idea of kind of creating these inessential barriers, essentially, not just for people who are trying to participate as suppliers, but also, limitations for kind of entering into certain jobs. One of them was this idea of countering degree inflation, which is always a funny one thinking about it from a higher ed perspective. This idea that because there are so many very well-educated people here in Massachusetts, many jobs are essentially saying you need a college degree to have this job, and then to make sure that people have college degrees so that they can get these jobs that maybe don't actually require the degree, but more kind of a skill set that might be associated with it. There are people who feel like they then need to go get that college degree. And the implication there being, the more that universities kind of turn into degree churn factories rather than kind of focusing on, specific, more diverse skill sets, you don't end up basically with a system that is matching the outputs, which is matching the needs here. So the idea of basically saying, please, employers, if you are big enough, justify degree requirements for jobs, basically. Don't say that everything needs a degree. Some people can do this job perfectly fine without one. So that was one suggestion. And then the last one that I think you're really going to like, Steve, not that it was the last one in the hearing, but a really big theme is just like mandate and fund better data collection. They're basically saying
I love that.
one big one was just saying, you can't fix a problem if you can't measure the problem. They really wanted to take a look at, regular disaggregated data collection on wealth, income, or poverty at the state level. They want that broken down by race, ethnicity, nativity, geography, funding research institutions that focus on it. So fundamentally, and you see this across healthcare fields, you see this across education, you see this across economic systems. The whole idea of like you can't actually address the problem without more information on it was a real key theme here that I expect makes your little Polster heart sing.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, if we're counting on a small sample size data set from 2015 to make policy, that is a problem. I mean, it is in a way. I don't doubt the general contours of that study, and I'm sure that the statistics that will come out from this study are also going to be alarming. But it would be nice if, as we're implementing policy year over year, we can see, oh, wait, this actually worked. Look, in this one area where we did this one intervention, stuff actually moved, as opposed to 11 years from now, we're going to fund another study and see retrospectively in general what changed with all of the things that happened in the last 11 years.
I do think that kind of brings us back to one of the major things that stood out to me to kind of hit that again is the idea that we are doing these massive kind of every 10 years sorts of check in. The reason that we say, hey, we're going to have more is because one of the groups that testified was, the Brookings Institution, talking about kind of the work that the Boston Fed has done. There's a group that includes the Boston Fed, the Boston Foundation, and Eastern Bank that is working on a survey right now, not just for the Boston metro area, but the full state, looking at what the racial wealth gaps are. And they said that the summary report is expected by the end of 2026, but they have the data in hand. So when we're referring to a new study, that is what we are referring to, because some of the data that was shared during the hearing was kind of grim. The Boston Women's Workforce Council actually showed in their 2025 report that the racial wage gap in the greater Boston area was 31 cents, which is worse actually than the 27-cent gap that was reported 2 years before that. There's a pretty big gap also between, Black women and Black men compared to white men, who earn respectively 53 cents and 55 cents on the dollar compared to white men. Also a pretty big wage gap when it comes to Hispanic women and men as well. So that was sort of one of the complicating factors in all of this, which was basically, the more intersectional these analyses get, the more complicated it gets. Are there some things that certain groups of women are feeling more or less than other groups of women? Yes. The gender wage gap has nearly halved since 2017 is what the Women's Workforce Council said. So basically, one thing that Rep. Russell Holmes kind of kept coming back to is essentially, the focus of this and the main split that they're seeing is not a gender split. It is very clearly a racial split, though, of course, there are complicating factors, and it becomes much more profound when you deal with, is one gender or the other head of a household, for instance. So the conversation is messy. We will have better data on it by the end of 2026, allegedly. And, hopefully we don't then have to wait another 11 years to figure out how things went since then.
All right. Well, we'll come back to that when we have more data. But for now, we have more to do, Jen. Should we carry on?
I'm Zainab Asma-Doyle, Research Director at the Massing Polling Group. The Massing Polling Group serves the region's leading foundations, political groups, government entities, and businesses. Our surveys and focus groups bring high-quality data to the toughest questions facing society today. Learn more at massingpolling.com.
And that brings us to our final segment, which this week is brought to you by our It's Fine, It's Fine, It's Fine. I'm not anxious and shaking for no good reason. I'm anxious and shaking because I have consumed 48 ounces of caffeine department. Steve, counteract that statement. Are we stressed or are we caffeinated?
First of all, we need to shorten our department names. I think that one got a little out of hand. We are not stressed, but very well caffeinated. According to a very scientific study that was reported on thewellnews.com, Massachusetts is actually the second least stressed out state in all of America. So before we get into how that study was done, Jen, I just have to ask you, sanity check. Does this pass the sanity check?
Insane. Literally insane. Who were they polling? This is crazy. Were they on the Savin Hill T station platform watching the red line crawl at a snail's pace over the hill toward the station while you watch everybody at the station grip their hands tighter and tighter, their knuckles whitening as they start vibrating anxiously, trying to figure out, is this train going to be taken out of service? I'm sorry, how are we not stressed, Steve?
Yeah, Jen, that was very powerful. I mean, that sounds like something you've experienced.
Every other day.
We are the second least. Hawaii is actually the most zen state, then Massachusetts, then, of all places, New York is apparently the third least stressed place, which I don't know. I've been to New York. That's hard to imagine. Minnesota and New Hampshire, those ones, okay, I could get behind those. But this very scientific study actually was brought to us by My Denver... Sorry, I tried to say it with a straight face. I often can't get through the method statements on these with a straight face because they get reported all over the place, and then you click on them, and this one came from My Denver Therapy, and the 5 indicators that they included were average weekly work hours, income relative to the national average, a composite health score, divorce rates, and unemployment. So basically, if you have a strong labor market and you're making a lot of money and you're healthy and married, then you are happy, or not stressed. You might not be happy, but you're at least not stressed, according to the study.
I think this is so funny because what I would sort of interpret this as is kind of like a shaming study here, saying what could you possibly have to be stressed about? You've got good jobs, you make a lot of money, you have better health care than others. All of these things must mean you can't be stressed. And again, I would like to say, where is their metric on transit access?
Yeah, that one's not included, but you can kind of get a sense of where they think stress is high. So if you want to explore those areas, that would be Mississippi, Arkansas, Nevada, Kentucky, and Louisiana. So I'm actually getting, you know what? This is just like blue-red. That's what this is. Democrats apparently are not stressed, according to this, and Republicans are stressed. So that's the conclusion that I'm drawing. Oh, but we should talk about the 48 ounce coffee that Dunkin' is now offering.
Yeah, isn't this stressing you out? Looking at the image of this absolutely stressed me out. That is a woman with a bucket.
And as I gather now, this thing that was just in one place is now everywhere, or no, it's still test locations, but you can get yourself 48 ounces, which is another way of saying 3 pounds of coffee, priced between $8 and $11. And you can have iced coffee, latte, a refresher, whatever that is. And it's basically double the size of a standard large cup. So I don't know. Are you getting one, Jen? Do you think Lisa Kaczynski would get one? That's the actual question that I have. Do you think she's got one already?
Really just out there in the universe manifesting Lisa Kaczynski with her Dunkin' bucket hat that she eventually did manage to get, with a bucket of coffee the size of a human head upon which could rest a bucket hat.
All right. Well, we need to test one of these. So I'll be back in about a month to visit, and Jen, you and I are going to get a 48 ounce coffee and also that BW3's Proteini thing that we're going to try one of those too.
I really don't know why. It just seems like we are going to end up in a place where we have like a live streamed episode of The Horse Race of just us having mental breakdowns over drink content for an hour.
That's such good content. Unfortunately, for those of you looking for good content, that is all the time we have for today. I'm Steve Cazella, signing off with Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is done by Charlie Cazella. You can write to us at thehorseracepodcast@gmail.com if you have revolting food products you'd like us to review. Don't forget to give The Horse Race a review wherever you're hearing us now. Subscribe to Commonwealth Beacon's daily download and reach out to us at the Massing Polling Group if you need polls or focus groups done. For now, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.